It's on to round 3 of Robot Masters vs Netnavis, where we take a character from Mega Man Classic and match them up against their Battle Network equivalent. Bear in mind, this is based on design and not who's supposedly tougher. If they don't have an EXE version, we instead pair them off with the closest Netnavi that's also missing a dance partner and have a bonus round which has its own separate score. At current, Classic is winning 9-8, with Battle Network tied if we count the bonus point, at least according to my scores. This round will focus on Mega Man 3, which is my favorite from the Classic series, so one side might have a bit of an edge, but I guess we'll see. With the basics out of the way, let me just say the Netnavis, the explosion, and then jump right into it. Starting off with Needle Man, huh? I normally fight him last, so I guess that just made me think he'd be later in the video. Anyway, the original is very blue, with a similar color scheme to Mega Man, to be honest. Huh. Wonder if there's anything significant about that. With Mega Man's obvious weakness to spikes, perhaps he was designed to be his natural enemy, the one to take him out and usurp his colors. Or, given that we get an even more obvious rival in this game, maybe that's just a load of nonsense and the creators just didn't want Rock to hold a monopoly on the hues. And when you look at the sprite work, he does look mostly dark blue. The light blues I always took to be more silver, the light playing tricks on me. He has an Airman type body, with no proper neck with his head fused into his chest. And until I looked at the art, I never noticed he had a crotch before. I always just thought of him as being shaped more like a pot or gourd. And while you can notice the red of his nose mouth gem in the sprite, the other red and yellows come across much better in the official art, showing that he has the 3 primary colors, so well rounded. Then there's the very obvious, very eye-catching needle hammer, the plate on his head with the 3 spikes that he can pop out with a piston or some other such device. It used to strike me as pretty goofy, but it's definitely grown on me, and given the aforementioned weakness to spikes, it's pretty practical with who he has to fight in the game. In fact, with his lack of hands, just the 2 needle cannons in their place, he seems designed with the sole purpose of killing Mega Man. Are we sure that Dr. Light was involved in designing him? I get how they'd be able to punch through hard materials, great for mining strange planets, but did he really need this many needles if he wasn't designed to kill? He also has a very Frieza army type armor, with the shoulder pads and the black materials beneath the torso and limbs. Again, I used to think it was pretty goofy looking, but now I can't help but appreciate his design. My apologies, Needle Man. And who could he be up against but Needleman.EXE, from the oft-overlooked network transmission, though anime fans are likely familiar with him. He too has the needle hammer, but his is a series of 4 needles, surrounding his head, which makes a prominent 5th. And he also has some odd torso proportions, his chest looking like some sort of gardening tool attachment or something, with its odd segments underneath that look like they could snap into something, and his shoulders being pretty far apart. He's missing some fingers, which are also missing some joints, adding to the inhuman, tool-like appearance, and his boots seem to be just one solid part. He's keeping the same color scheme, with the yellows and light blues being more prominent, and with his yellow eyes and teeth, which seems to always be smirking, he has a pretty wicked appearance. With how his parts are spread, and his extra spikes, it kinda adds to the feeling that the dude is bad news. It's a really strong showing from both boys, but while I really like the RM, Needle.EXE actually ranks as one of my top navis with just how sadistic he looks, so Battle Network takes first point. Magnet Man is primarily red and white, with black filling in his body outside of the armor, with just a bit of yellow and green for accents. And yeah, he uses magnets, so red and white works. His helmet is pretty basic, it covering pretty much all but his eyes. With his mouth covered, and the magnet on his forehead, he almost makes me think of a ninja, with the accessory taking the place of a headband, or, say, throwing star. No idea where that thought came from. His red chest piece isn't too complex. It gives some protection, and some of his black bodysuit even creeps out around the shoulders, rather than the way they're normally completely covered up. He has those white surfaces on his boots, which I'm not sure if they serve a purpose or are just there for flair, but they do kinda make him look more manufactured somehow. And he has the little launcher on his right arm, kinda like Quickman did. Nice. The green on it also complements his eyes. While not too complex, I do think the design works well. EXE is a bruiser, just look at how big this guy is. The red, white, and black to fill in the gaps return, but he also has a fair bit of gray. His upper torso and head are both magnets, obviously, and while his proportions may not look too crazy, just huge, with the dips in between each side of the magnet, I don't think a normal human would be able to fit into one as a costume. His hands are huge, he's missing a finger on each, and they're all pretty square. Pair that with his wrist guards and his leg bits, which look very much like they were snapped on, right over his limbs, along with all the perfect circles, and we're back to the very manufactured look, like the original. Given how they're going very heavily in on the whole stereotypical man-made magnet look, it works really well. In fact, you could say that it really pulls the design together. Both Magnet Men are really all about magnets, simple enough. But while the RM looks like any old android with some accessory slapped on him, EXE takes it to the next level, really committing to the look, so again, I'm giving it to Battle Network. And we have 2 in a row who get no love, so time for some bonus rounds. Count them if you want. We'll start with the twins, Gemini Man. He has a black bodysuit with some white and cool blues thrown in on top, him not really having any chest armor. Between the crystals on his head, diamonds on his boots, the reflective chest, and his color scheme, I always looked at him as being sort of an ice boss for some reason, and was wondering if there was something I was missing from the mythology, but no, it's more about 2 of the words I mentioned in passing, reflective crystals. The bit on his upper body looking like a mirror in the official art. His weapon is the Gemini laser, and he also projects light, probably through glass and mirrors to create a duplicate. It's honestly not a bad design, though a bit heady for child me and hard to get across in sprite form, but hey, if you get an art book, you might be able to piece it together. Maybe why we only have 1 horoscope boss, though 3 does take place in space, so the constellation angle works. Let's pair him with the other Master of Light, Laserman.EXE. A pretty cool design, largely black, which contrasts the spectrum he can put out, with some cool blue for outline stuff. His eye looks like a slit cut into some black glass, and his 2 shoulder tubes make me think of prisms somehow, though they're probably mirror-aligned, further connecting him to Gemini. And we have one of our few 5-fingered Navis today, marking him as a more complex, sophisticated character. And then he has the weird beast bird toes. They honestly feel kind of out of place. Still though, he's really sleek looking and edgy as crap, which not everyone can pull off, and even though the feetsies bug me a bit, I'd give him the nod over Gemini. Then there's Hardman, who might have had a better shot at getting a Navi adaptation had he been called anything else, like maybe Punch Man? He's another blue boy, though from his sprites, I took him to be more of a very dark gray, but both work. He's a very solidly built guy made out of metal, which is hard, I guess. A friend of mine compared him to a cement mixer, which isn't a connection I would have made, but looking at both, yeah, kinda. If he doesn't have that, he doesn't really have much going on. He's just a somewhat stocky robot with a flat, indented helmet, and yellow jewel being some of the few things to set him apart. Looking at the official art, it does look like he can swivel on his waist-height indent, which is neat. Still though, his rocket punch attack is probably the only noteworthy thing really about him, which doesn't come across in his design, you just kind of notice he can do it when he does it. As for his competition, I'm matching him with Judgeman.EXE since they're both big, blue guys. Sorry, Hardman really doesn't give me a lot to go off of here. Judgeman is made of books, which, as an avid reader, appeals to me. It most notably forms his large judge robe. The blue and yellow are his covers, and the white inseams the pages. The purple for his hands and feet work really well with his other colors. He also has an electric whip for some reason, which feels like a nod to a certain other Capcom character. And he has a yellow mouth to, I don't know, filter his biases or something. While I wish I could say more about Hardman, I just really love how Judgeman looks, no matter what my brother says. He's a really awesome design. It should go without saying, but Battle Network gets another bonus point. Back to people Capcom cared about, we have Top Man. The RM is mostly orange, with some black, white, yellow, and even brown thrown in for the wheels. His head is a top, but unlike Magnet, who just has his namesake slapped on, it seems to actually be part of his head. While the official art makes it look like one solid piece, given the tossing of others out of it, maybe it's just the shell and he has some sort of way to create more inside, along with a Beyblade Rever to get them started. He's also rocking the shoulder pads, which seems to be a pattern this time around. And in his boots he has Heelys, before they were even a thing, I think. Wheels aren't something that really comes up when I think of tops, but given how he uses them to spin around like one, it makes sense. Between his skater poses and the expressions he wears, he gives off a lot of attitude, which is kinda funny given how silly a deadly robot that uses tops is conceptually. Compare that to Top.EXE, who pretty much completely changes the color scheme, only a bit of yellow returning. Still, given how it's hard to confuse him for anyone else, I guess they really didn't need to copy-paste. His head is still a top, and his face is flat, him looking almost hand-carved with his finished wood coloration. The black and reds give him a more serious look, and with his cane, pipe, and slightly bent forward posture, it gets across his old man vibes. Maybe tops were more topical during Mega Man 3, but when Battle Network 4 was made, I imagine they were pretty outdated pretty much everywhere, so the old toy paired with the old man gets the point across well. Still though, while I like his color scheme and theming, I'm not the biggest on his design. Maybe it's that I think a toy-themed character should be more whimsical, maybe I don't like the stereotypes, maybe I just don't like that he smokes since I'm asthmatic, but whatever it is, I'm just not a fan of EXE, where Top Man suits the Battle Top image in my head more, so Classic finally gets one. Snake Man is a robot in a snake hood, pretty straightforward. It's almost like the one Link wears, but with metal segments. A lot of his armor is white, which, given the edgier design, I would have expected to be black, which they say for just the bodysuit. I think it's a pretty striking palette. His buster isn't anything special, it almost looking exactly like a recolor of Mega Man's, but the green diamonds on his boots stand out, looking like they could be a fang, scale, or claw, though that last one wouldn't make much sense for a serpent. And he has the shoulder pads, even more distinct than the ones mentioned previously. Going back to the snake though, it has a jaw with a hinge, and it looks like it's eating Snake Man's head. Both him and it have red eyes, though the snake's looks almost like rubies. You know, for the longest time, while I liked Snake Man, I thought he was a little too simple, him just being a guy with a snake on his head, but looking at him more closely, it seems more so like those hunters who turn their kills into a pelt or the like. Think Hercules with the Nemean lion. Given that he is a reconnaissance droid, him moving about with wildlife and maybe even claiming their skin as his own makes sense, so good design! Moving on to the Navi, he's another one that doesn't follow the original's colors all that closely. Him keeping the green, then throwing in some yellows and purples. Perhaps they give the impression that he's venomous. Given the Cobra headpiece, that would make sense. He has the red eyes, with the slit irises this time, and a human mouth under the hood? Still a forked tongue though. He's coming out of a pot for that Snake Charmers feel, and has two vine-like arms, coming out of the headpiece, with some purple wristlets and pointed fingers. With the hinge on his jaw, vent-like patterns on his chest, his smoother surfaces, and blue flames coming out of his pot, he still looks pretty robot-like, which is kind of the pattern here, but feels a little unnecessary somehow. He has arms, so he wasn't gonna feel like a real snake anyway, I guess. He's another one that kind of bothers me. The color scheme feels a little off, the human mouth feels really out of place, and while I normally like stretchy arms, there's just something weird about these. So as you can probably guess, Classic gets this one too. Sparkman has always looked unfinished to me. Part of it's his sprite, me not being able to make out his mouth, making it look like his face was ripped off. Part of it's probably his shelf-like upper torso and rigid lower half, both looking like a base that something was supposed to be added onto. It also doesn't help that he has needle arms when we already have a needle man. And his largely orange color scheme, with some white and black thrown in, helps me realize how much overlap there is in this set. Huh. Still, the spark plug for his helmet is neat. Compare that to his alternate reality version, who looks like what the original was meant to be. Keeping the orange but adding yellow, very sensible for an elect Navi, his needle arms are more impressive, with what looks like a power gauge on the side. The orange bits around his upper body look snapped on, like they're maybe there to prevent someone from electrocuting themselves. His feet are just circles, which doesn't seem very practical, but they seem to have some sort of joint in the base, so they aren't totally stiff. Bring back the spark plug head, throw in some green for flair, and while I'm not too crazy about the design, I do like it more than the original, so... Rounding things out is Shadow Man. The The original is doing this thing where a lot of his armor looks like it could be cloth, but isn't. His helmet has this odd fold to it, the top part kinda sticking out farther than the rest. I think it's meant to give the impression of him wearing an actual ninja hood, the excess cloth sticking out behind him. Likewise, he has some netting in his cleavage, which is another common ninja element, but seeing the vent on his back establishes that the chest is covered in armor and not cloth. As for his color palette, most of his costume is the shade of blue that would be easy to mistake for black under some light, actual black being for his underarmor, white for the secondary parts of his armor like the wrist and feet, and a yellow belt looking thing that really stands out since it's the only warm color. I think the contrast between the white and the blues and the blacks look great. His shoulders are spherical, which I imagine makes moving around his arms easy and makes him seem somewhat more action focused. In addition to all that, he has a shuriken on his head, which may look a little silly, but saved him from the ninja headband cliche that would become popular with Naruto, and the whole wearing your weapon on your head thing makes him kinda work as a pair with Magnet Man. I really like ninjas, so I love how they took a lot of the stereotypes and managed to make them more robotic, with how they're now made up of metal. EXE is another strong design and continues the trend. His dark blues are now purple and whites gray, with some red thrown in. His helmet is still doing the tucked back hood thing, and the shuriken is there too, but with a bit more detail. And his face is completely covered outside of his eyes, as more fits the trope. New typical ninja stuff has been thrown in, such as his red scarf, which seems to be one solid metal piece, and the sandals and tabi on his feet also look like they're made of metal. His spiked elbow pads and rings around his wrist are more where I'd expect to find solid armor on a shinobi, using them for defense and maybe even to strike an opponent, but they still look cool, even if they're not so much of a subversion. And Man.EXE has a katana. Yup, just a straight up Japanese sword. Not a weird cyberblade that overrides his arms, but an actual katana that he pulls out of its sheath and swings with both hands, making us come full circle on the whole ninja but metal thing to an actual real world item. Just because. Now here's where we get to the hard part, because I need to pick a favorite, between two that are easily some of my favorites from their respective series. Both had the same basic idea in mind and share a good number of elements, yet managed to be very different. No Cutman situation where one is just a fancier version of the other and I need to decide whether I like the extra flair. I finished Battle Network 6 weeks ago and could have done this video anytime after that, but a big reason I didn't was just because I didn't want to have to make this decision. Between planning this and thinking about this and writing this, I've gone back and forth a few times, and hey, I might even change my mind again when recording, but I need to get this video out at some point. I was gonna go with the Robot Master since he really embodies the whole rustic and sci-fi blend I've been talking about, but looking at EXE again, and I mean really looking, I think he might manage to somehow pull off the vibe even more, and hey, being purple doesn't hurt either. I think I'm locking Battle Network in for my choice, though it was the hardest decision I had to make for this, and I don't think anything will top it. So yeah, guess I'm over the hump, and can probably do the rest of the series without stressing too much. Now to go beyond Robot Master, to Rush. Take a dog, slap him in some Mega Man armor, and this is what you get. He works really well alongside Rock, him having the same rectangled bumps on his helmet, the beautiful blue eyes, and his red and pinks do well to contrast the owner's blues and light blues. And just so you don't go thinking he's a real pupper in there, you have the bolt sticking out for his joints, and his tail is pretty much one stiff piece. Really, most things I can say about Mega Man, I can say about Rush. He's just a really good companion design. Rush.EXE, though, stands upright and has a very cute design. He uses a lot more browns, like you'd expect for a dog, and has a red collar around his neck. He has big, floppy ears that add to his cuteness and maybe flap in the wind to make him look cool, which is a gag they do a lot in the anime to add some levity given that he's more of a gag character. As for which is better, well, like I said, Rush Original fits Mega Man to a T. EXE, though, looks a lot more generic. Don't get me wrong, I really like him, but his design is one that could work for a lot of anime and cartoons. I wouldn't look at him and just think Mega Man, unlike the classic version. Thus, classic takes the point. Then of course there's Proto Man. He looks pretty spiffy. A lot of him is just a recolor of Mega Man. Red boots, gloves, and buster, with a gray rather than light blue bodysuit, and a red belt, rather than strongman underwear. How similar they are establishes them pretty well as a cool rival character and hints at their relationship, and red and blue are both primary colors and make the pair easy to tell apart. Think of how most Pokemon games have a warm and cool color to separate the versions. The big distinguishing traits, though, are his helmet, scarf, and shield. The helmet has the same basic shape as Mega Man's, but whereas his was pretty minimalist with the extras, Blue's has the shades over his eyes that obscure his identity, which was kinda played off as being a secret in-game, and are considered so integral to the design that, when a lot of people do street clothes interpretations of the characters, he still has them, typically in the exact same shape, making you wonder if they're not actually a part of his helmet but something he wears underneath. He's also got a little bit of white above his eyes, as well as the ears, which are the only place that it appears on his person and makes it really stand out. His shield, though, is primarily white with just a bit of red around the edges, which kind of inverts his color scheme. When you look at the slit for the eyes at the top, it shows that it's meant to be used aggressively in combat, him being able to rush forward with it, even when he has it up, somehow turning what should be a defensive option into a more reckless one. It's also a bit reminiscent of the early Joe models, tying him back into the beginning of the series and making you question whether he wasn't planned from the start, as the number 000 would imply. Lastly, there's his scarf, which is another bit of extra flair, something to blow in the wind to look cool, and add some yellow to complete the whole primary color thing. And I never noticed until looking at this art, but it's tied behind him, rather than just wrapped around. If he weren't a robot, I'd be worried he'd choke himself, but it's a good way to make sure he doesn't lose it. While I'm not always a fan of Blue's in-game, I have to admit, he has a really good design. On the other end of things, we have Proto Man.EXE. He's still mostly red, but is using the white a bit more here, with the ring on his helmet, his Navi symbol, toes, and hair. Speaking of, very few Navis get to have hair, not even roll, most of them just having armor or other pieces that kind of take the place of it, so it shows how special Blue's is. It takes the place of his scarf, something to blow in the wind. The shades in his helmet are a bit thinner and sleeker, and he has a horn now to make him more aerodynamic? Or just to make him look cooler and edgier. That's why, even though he still has the shield, which he materializes when needed, he's typically portrayed more with his sword, for that extra edge. He has a few other ones on top of that, from the points coming off his boots, to his poke your eyes out shoulder pads. And rather than gray, his bodysuit is black and purple, which I guess work with the rest of his colors? So which is better, original or EXE? Original kind of has a biker feel to him, with his simple but cool helmet and scarfed up letter behind him. EXE is also like a biker, but a more futuristic one, like one I'd expect to see on some sci-fi inspired bike in some big fancy Tokyo drift race, but the anime could be affecting me here. While this might sound weird, I kinda have the same problem with him as I did with Quickman. He just looks like he's trying a bit too hard. I'd say he's trying to look cool, whereas the original just is, no effort needed, so I'm giving it the classic. And we're doing Proto Man twice, because we get Break Man too. Classic is just Proto Man, but with a metal face mask and Sniper Joe eye. While not too much of a change, you know what? I like Zaku's, so the glowing Cyclops eye kinda does it for me. And Breakman.exe is a missile battery with a single head face thing, 2 tiny legs, and 2 arms that are also missile launchers. He looks more like a stage enemy, and a boring one at that, than a Navi. So I'm not gonna drag this out, Proto Man wins. Again. So where does that take us? Well, Classic got 5 points this round, and Battle Network got 4, bringing the grand total to Classic 14 and Network 12, with the bonus round being 0 to 3. BN taking 2 points this video. Sheesh, if it wasn't for the extra characters, Battle Network would have ran away with this one, though letting Proto Man go twice feels kinda like cheating. Still, given how much I love Mega Man 3, I find this a little disturbing. Anyway, with that, the long-awaited 3rd installment is finally done, and I can probably feel comfortable about making a playlist. The rest should come a bit faster, though I still need to play Cybe's Falzer and Battle Chip Challenge for 4. As always, thanks for watching, feel free to give me your own votes in the comments, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into Mega Man, for everlasting peace.